The door chimed like it always did. Familiar, mechanical, ignored. Heads barely turned. A few glances flickered up, then back down to screens, coffee cups, and spreadsheets. Someone near the teller line shifted slightly, catching a glimpse, then rolled her eyes and whispered something under her breath. Another adjusted his tie and stepped a little farther away, as if proximity alone might demand engagement. Walter Jennings, 64 years old, stood just inside the bank entrance. He looked like he didn't belong. Not here, not now, not among the suits and sleek Bluetooth headsets and polished marble floors. His coat was faded and frayed, hanging too loose on his frame. The soles of his boots scraped softly with every step, worn down for miles that no one cared to imagine. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't loud, but he was out of place. And in that room, out of place was enough to make people uncomfortable. No one said anything directly. No one had to. The silence spoke its own language, one of dismissal, of quiet judgment. They didn't see Walter. They saw what they expected. Another old black man with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. Behind the counter, Brittany barely glanced at him before her customer service smile faded. Her tone was flat. "Sir, if you're here to make a withdrawal, we'll need your ID or debit card." Walter didn't respond right away. He took another step forward, steady but deliberate, as if each movement carried weight. All around him, eyes avoided him. They weren't curious. They weren't kind. They had already decided who he was before he ever said a word. Walter Jennings took one more step toward the counter, the sound of his worn boots echoing louder than they should have in a room full of people pretending not to notice him. Brittany, the teller, tilted her head. Her practiced customer service smile was already gone, replaced by a look of thinly veiled impatience. She had seen people like him before, wandering in off the street, asking for change, maybe trying to stay warm for a few minutes. She sighed, tapping her pen against the desk. "If you're not making a transaction," she said, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Walter's voice was calm, low, but unwavering. "I need to speak with someone about the land," he said. Brittany blinked. "Land?" He nodded. "Yes, the land this bank is built on." There was a pause. Then, like a ripple in still water, the room reacted. A soft snort came from the desk beside her. One of the junior tellers, a young guy in a tight shirt and flashy watch, leaned toward Brittany and whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Is he for real?" Before Brittany could respond, someone else stepped in. Cliff Wallace, assistant branch manager, always ready to assert control, strode over from the other side of the lobby. His sleeves were rolled neatly to the elbows, and his jaw was set in that way men wear when they think they're about to shut something down. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice just a little too loud for the space. Brittany straightened. "He says he owns the land the bank's sitting on." Cliff let out a laugh that turned heads. "I think you got the wrong place, friend. This isn't the courthouse. You can't just walk in and say you own a bank." Walter met his eyes. Calm, measured. "I didn't say I own the bank," he said. "I said I own the land." That subtle correction shifted the tone, but not the reactions. More chuckles. Someone near the front door murmured, "This is wild." Even the security guard by the entrance, who had been scrolling through his phone the whole time, looked up now, half interested, half ready to escort Walter out. Cliff crossed his arms, grinning. "Okay, you got paperwork, Mr. Landowner?" Walter didn't flinch. "I do." That quiet sentence landed like a pin drop, but the smirks didn't disappear. "You're telling me," Cliff said, slowly, dragging out each word like a joke he was building up to, "that after all these years, this building, this property, was built on land that belongs to you?" Walter gave the smallest nod. Cliff turned, gesturing broadly to the rest of the lobby, as if performing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now banking on borrowed land." A few people laughed, unsure if they should, but Walter didn't react. He didn't raise his voice, didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, hands relaxed, eyes steady, waiting. And somehow, that unsettled Cliff more than any argument would have. Brittany looked down at her desk. The young guy with the flashy watch tapped his pen on the counter and muttered, "This is ridiculous." Maybe it was. Or maybe, just maybe, they were about to find out it wasn't. The laughter hadn't quite died down, but was starting to taper off, thinning under the weight of Walter's silence. He stood at the counter, still and unmoved, like a stone in a rushing current. Cliff Wallace's smirk had begun to fade, just slightly, though he still wore his arrogance like a well-ironed blazer. Walter didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply reached into his coat pocket. It was a slow movement, deliberate, and in that small moment, something shifted in the room. The security guard, a young man named Darren, who had mostly been scrolling on his phone since his shift began, suddenly straightened. His hand hovered just near his belt, not aggressive, but alert. The world had trained him to brace whenever a black man reached into a pocket. But Walter didn't move like someone trying to start trouble. He moved like someone handling something fragile. The coat rustled as he dug deeper, fingers pressing past a lining. And then he pulled it out, a thick, weather-worn envelope, faded and soft around the edges, the kind of paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times to count. It was sealed with an old brass clasp, the kind no one used anymore. Walter laid it gently on the counter in front of Brittany, patting it once with his palm. "This," he said softly, "has been in my family for over a century." Cliff leaned in, squinting at the envelope like it might fall apart if he looked too hard. "What is that? Some handwritten letter from your cousin?" Walter's fingers moved carefully, opening the flap. Inside, he pulled out a stack of papers, yellow creased but still perfectly legible. At the top of the first page, in bold block lettering, it read, "Franklin County Land Deed, 1914. Owner, Ezekiel Jennings." Stamped below were notary seals, inked signatures, embossed markings from a courthouse that had been torn down decades ago. Walter turned the document around for them to see. "My grandfather bought this land in 1914, he said. It was part of a cooperative, black tradesmen, farmers, and ministers who pooled what they had so their children could have something to stand on. He never sold it. He leased it to a lumber company in the 20s, then a warehouse, and eventually someone built your bank on it, but no one ever bought it." For the first time, Brittany didn't have anything to say. She stared at the papers like she was seeing ghosts. Cliff scoffed, but his voice had lost its edge. "That's a 100-year-old document. You expect us to take that seriously?" Walter didn't blink. "You should." The room was quiet again, only now it wasn't dismissive. It was uncertain. Darren, the security guard, stepped closer, not in defense, not in force, just curious. He leaned slightly, eyes scanning the notary seal on the deed. That looks legit," he muttered, almost to himself. Cliff glanced around the room. People were watching now, not laughing, not smirking, watching. His smirk twisted into a grimace. "All right, you've had your say, but this isn't the place to sort out fairy tales. You need to leave, sir." Walter's voice was calm, almost gentle. "No, I think it's time someone read what's in this envelope." And the look in his eyes told everyone in that bank. He wasn't going anywhere. Walter's hands rested gently on the old papers as his voice softened, no longer speaking to just the people in the room, but to time itself. "My grandfather's name was Ezekiel Jennings," he began, eyes fixed on the yellow deed in front of him. "Born in 1889, son of a freedman. Worked with his hands every day of his life. They say he could build a house faster than most men could plan one." There was a stillness to the way Walter spoke, as if every word was weighted with memory. Ezekiel didn't just build porches and barns. He built something that lasted longer, an idea. He and a few other men, black carpenters, preachers, farmers, pooled what little they had to form something they called the Jennings Land Cooperative. It wasn't about money. It was about dignity, about having something to pass down, about owning a piece of earth no one could take from you. His voice caught for a moment. This land, this spot, was one of the first plots the cooperative acquired. Back then, it was nothing but weeds and red clay, just outside the edge of town. No one cared about it then. But Ezekiel did. He made sure the deed included a clause, one that said if the land was ever leased and the terms weren't renewed, ownership would return to his bloodline. Walter looked up, scanning the room. For the first time, a few eyes met his without flinching. "My grandfather didn't leave us much in the way of money," he said quietly. "But he left us this. And I'm here to make sure no one forgets that." Walter sat alone in a folding chair in the corner of the break room, a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee resting between his palms. For a moment, the noise of the bank outside faded, the whispers, the tension, the sideways glances. All that remained was memory. "My father's name was Henry," he said quietly to no one in particular. "Henry Jennings. Folks called him Hank. He wasn't the kind of man who made speeches or stood up in front of rooms. He built fences, repaired roofs. He taught me to keep my head down and my hands busy." Walter stared into the coffee, like the swirling liquid could bring the past into focus. "He used to talk about this land," he continued. "Said his daddy Ezekiel bought it fair and square, that the land was leased, never sold. But when I was a kid, that just sounded like one of those stories men tell when they've had too much to drink or too many hard years. I didn't believe him. Thought it was just talk." He let out a breath that was half sigh, half apology. "When things got rough, my father got quieter. After my mom passed, he started drinking, the work dried up, and so did his stories. By the time I was grown, everything he used to say about the land just sounded like old noise, bedtime tales that never meant anything." Walter paused, gripping the cup a little tighter. But then 2020 happened. He didn't have to explain. Everyone in the country knew what that year had done to jobs, to homes, to families. Walter found himself sleeping in the basement of a church in East Atlanta. The shelter wasn't fancy, just mattresses on the floor and donated food, but it was warm and it was quiet, and it had a storage closet for personal belongings. One night, Walter said, "I opened the last box of my father's things. Been carrying for years, town to town, shelter to shelter. Never really looked inside. Figure it was just junk. Old mail, broken tools." He paused, his voice softening. But there it was, tucked inside an envelope, wrapped in wax paper like it was something sacred. A folded piece of parchment with my grandfather's name on it. Deed, 1914, stamped, signed, legal. Walter's eyes grew distant, as if he were still in that cold storage room, holding the fragile weight of history. There was a note, too, in my father's handwriting. Just a few words. "If you find this, don't let them say we didn't leave you nothing." He swallowed hard. That was the moment I stopped surviving and started digging. I went to the library, talked to the county clerk, sat with a probate lawyer, who didn't laugh when I told her what I found. She traced it all: parcel numbers, filing gaps, every transaction that ignored the reversion clause in Ezekiel's deed. Walter looked down at the folder beside him, the same one he had carried into that lobby like it was the last piece of himself he hadn't given up on. For 50 years, this paper followed me, through cities, through shelters, through winters I didn't think I'd survive. I didn't hold on to it because I knew what it meant. I held on to it because something in me knew it mattered. He looked toward the hallway, where the tension still waited behind glass doors. And now they're finally listening. The document spread across John Delgado's desk looked like something from another era. Thick parchment, ink seals faded but unmistakable, notary stamps from a courthouse that no longer existed. The paper smelled faintly of wax and cedar, like the inside of a forgotten drawer. The branch manager wasn't the type to rattle easily. He'd been with the bank 22 years, had dealt with fraud, threats, protests, even a brief bomb scare once during a merger. But none of it felt quite like this. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the deed again. Ezekiel Jennings, 1914. Reversion clause. Unexpired lease. John pushed back in his chair and stared out through the blinds at the man still standing calmly at the teller counter. Walter Jennings hadn't moved. He wasn't talking. He wasn't pacing. He was simply waiting, hands folded in front of him, his presence quiet, but commanding. John stood slowly and reached for the desk phone. He hesitated only a second before punching in the direct line. "This is John Delgado at Peachtree Branch." I need regional compliance on the line. Now. His voice was low, but it carried enough weight to silence the nearest two desks. The air in the bank began to shift. You could feel it. Tension settled like fog across the lobby. Out front, Brittany wasn't smirking anymore. She stood stiffly, stealing glances at Walter from the corner of her eye. The junior teller beside her had stopped playing with his pen. His hands were still, his jaw tense. Cliff Wallace, still pacing, muttered under his breath, "This is insane." But even he had stopped laughing. Whatever confidence he had worn earlier now felt paper-thin. John hung up the phone and adjusted his tie. His face had changed, no longer skeptical, no longer dismissive. Now it was tight, serious, controlled. "Someone from Regional is on the way," he said quietly to Brittany as he passed the counter. "Don't say anything else to him." She nodded, but Walter had heard. He heard everything. In the back of the bank, the door to the employee hallway opened. A few heads turned. People whispered. Someone was already texting. Outside the glass office, the whispers were no longer about amusement. They were about uncertainty. "Is this for real?" one of the tellers asked quietly. "I don't know," the other replied, but Delgado looked spooked. Even the security guard, Darren, who'd taken a few skeptical steps forward earlier, was now standing just a little closer to Walter. Not to remove him, but to understand him. He wasn't acting like a man who'd lost touch with reality. He was acting like someone who knew something they didn't, and that realization was making people nervous. Walter stood the same way he had when he walked in, calm, rooted, steady. But now, people were noticing more than just his coat and boots. They were noticing the folder, the documents, the way the branch manager had retreated into his office and emerged visibly shaken. They were noticing the shift, a shift not just in tone, but in power. Walter hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a scene, but he'd said enough to make the highest-ranking person in the building stop what he was doing, pick up a phone, and call people far above his pay grade. And that, more than anything else, made the room feel smaller, quieter. The teller line was still, the lobby hushed, and as Walter remained right where he was, no one dared ask him to leave again. The rear door to the branch swung open with a soft click, and a man in a navy-tailored suit stepped briskly through. His shoes tapped crisply against the tile, each step clean and precise. He wore thick-rimmed glasses, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm, an ID badge clipped to his jacket. Gerald Tisdale, Regional Property and Compliance. He didn't stop to greet anyone, didn't ask for directions. He already knew exactly where to go. John Delgado, the branch manager, was waiting at the entrance of his office. Without exchanging pleasantries, he motioned Gerald inside and quietly closed the glass door behind them. From outside, staff tried to carry on like nothing was happening, but it was impossible. The energy in the lobby had shifted again. What had begun as laughter and disbelief had hardened into tension, and now, something closer to fear. Walter remained exactly where he had been since the moment he stepped in. Silent, composed, watchful. Cliff Wallace stood with his arms crossed, eyes darting between the office and the man at the counter, his usual confidence slowly draining from his posture. Inside the office, Gerald had spread the documents across the desk, his brow furrowed as he read. He flipped the deed over, then back again. His fingers traced a faded notary stamp near the bottom. Another sheet, a typed letter from a probate firm in Chattanooga, rested on top of the stack. "This clause here," he muttered, pointing to a sentence buried in the deed small print, "says that ownership of the land reverts to the original family if the lease is not renewed or a sale is not executed." John nodded slowly. It was leased in 1927 to a lumber company, then a warehouse, then a credit union in the 70s. But the lease was never formally renewed after the mergers. And the current bank, Gerald asked, built on top of it in 2004 after the acquisition. We assumed the land was part of the purchase. But John's voice trailed off. There's no title transfer on file. Gerald leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses. That means this building is sitting on land we have no legal right to occupy. There's a long pause. Both men knew the gravity of what that meant. I'm going to need a direct line to corporate legal, Gerald said. Now. Outside, the blinds were still partially open. A few slats revealed 10 silhouettes inside the office. Brittany tried not to stare, but her fingers fidgeted with paperclip, her eyes drifting again to Walter, who stood unmoved, like a statue carved from patience. Darren, the security guard, leaned against the wall near the door. He didn't say anything, but the way he watched Gerald's every movement suggested something had clicked, that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was real. Cliff walked slowly over to Brittany and whispered, "What are they even looking at?" "It's just some old paper." She didn't respond, because deep down, she was starting to believe it wasn't. Inside the office, Gerald's tone shifted from analytical to urgent. He scribbled notes, highlighted clauses, and underlined key phrases. The kind of frantic organization that only happened when someone realized they were already too late. "There's a public title gap," Gerald finally said. "No signed release. No recorded sale. And that reversion clause was never satisfied." John ran a hand down his face. "So what do we do?" Gerald looked through the blinds. Directly at Walter. "We're in trouble." Inside the office, Gerald Tisdale stood frozen. His pen hovered over the notepad, his mouth slightly open but with no words ready. John Delgado, still behind the desk, stared blankly at the documents, shoulders slumped under the weight of revelation he wasn't trained to handle. And across from them, Walter Jennings sat quietly. He wasn't smug. He didn't gloat. He looked tired, but at peace, like a man who had finally put his burden down after carrying it far longer than he should have had to. "We can offer a settlement," John finally said, his voice cautious. "Something fair, of course. If we can resolve this today, privately, that would be best for everyone involved." Walter didn't answer right away. He studied the two men across from him, educated, polished, well-fed, and saw the nervous flicker in their eyes. The kind of flicker that only comes when power realizes it may no longer be in control. He leaned forward, folding his hands gently over the edge of the table. "What's fair to you?" he asked quietly. John hesitated. "We'd have to negotiate that. But the sooner we can come to an agreement, the better." Walter gave a soft laugh, not bitter, not sarcastic. "Just tired. I didn't come here for a check," he said. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Then what did you come here for?" Walter's voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. It was the kind of voice that carried weight, because it didn't chase attention. "I came for the truth," he said. "And maybe a bit of respect. That's not so hard to give, is it?" Silence stretched across the room. Neither man spoke. For a moment, even the constant hum of fluorescent lighting seemed to fade. But outside, things were changing. A woman on her lunch break sat by the window, scrolling through her phone. When she realized something serious was happening inside, she opened her camera and hit the red Go Live button. Her voice could be heard faintly as she whispered to her viewers. "Y'all, something's going down at the Peachtree Bank. There's this older guy in a trench coat. Says he owns the land the bank is built on." And the manager looked shook. By the time the words left her lips, the viewer count was already climbing. Inside, Walter didn't know he was being streamed. But maybe he felt it, that shift in the air, that subtle change when a private moment starts to become public. Brittany, standing at her station, noticed a woman holding her phone up against the glass. She nudged her co-worker. "Are we being recorded?" The junior teller leaned in. "That Liv's got like 1,000 people watching." Cliff, who had remained mostly silent since being pushed to the sidelines, suddenly stepped forward. "We need to shut that down. Now." But he wasn't in control anymore. None of them were. The center of gravity in the room had moved. It wasn't in the manager's office. It wasn't behind the teller counter. It was with the man in the threadbare coat, who had asked for nothing more than dignity, and in doing so, exposed how little of it they'd offered him. And while the world beyond the glass began to take notice, Walter sat still, his hand on the envelope, his back straight, his silence speaking louder than any press release ever could. Cliffhanger, and the eyes watching from outside were just getting started. Later that afternoon, the air inside the branch had grown thick, not just with tension, but anticipation. A new figure entered through the rear security door, his presence instantly noticeable. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes, and a silk tie that looked like it could pay someone's rent for a month. His briefcase was leather, monogrammed. His demeanor was crisp, controlled, and clearly corporate. His name was Clay Addison, a senior legal representative from the bank's national office. He walked straight past the stairs, past the murmuring tellers, and into John Delgado's office, where Walter sat patiently, still with that envelope close by, like it was part of him. Clay sat across the table and offered a practiced smile. Not warm, not cold, just rehearsed. Mr. Jennings, he began, opening his briefcase. First, allow me to say we acknowledge the validity of your documentation. It's clear that the situation is unique. Walter said nothing. Clay continued. Our client is prepared to offer a financial settlement for a permanent transfer of ownership rights. We like to resolve this quietly and efficiently. He slid a manila folder across the desk. Walter didn't touch it. How generous is this offer? He asked, his voice even. Clay straightened his tie. It's substantial. A fair valuation of the land, adjusted for today's market. We believe it reflects both the property's worth and the spirit of cooperation. Walter glanced at the folder, then back at Clay. You think that's what this is about? He asked. You think I carried this envelope for 50 years just to cash it in? Clay's expression didn't change. With all due respect, Mr. Jennings, most people would be grateful. Walter leaned forward slightly, not angry, but firm. You can't buy what was stolen through silence, he said. And you sure as hell can't buy back what your people forgot to return. Clay paused. Then what would satisfy you? Walter didn't hesitate. I want a plaque. Out front, with my grandfather's name on it. Ezekiel Jennings. I want the city records updated to reflect what was always true. And I want a foundation started in his name, a fund that helps families like mine. People living in motels, shelters, cars. People no one wants to see until it's too late. Clay blinked, caught off guard. You're asking for a public monument and a fund. I'm not asking, Walter said. I'm offering a way forward. The room went still. Clay leaned back, thinking. His polished confidence had begun to fray. This wasn't a negotiation about dollars and cents anymore. It was something far more uncomfortable. Truth. I'll have to bring this to the board, he said after a long pause. You do that, Walter replied, folding his arms. Clay collected the folder and stood. If this becomes public. It already is, Walter cut in. You just haven't figured out how loud it's about to get. As Clay walked out, the silence in the room didn't feel like a victory or a loss. It felt like a line had been drawn. And Walter Jennings, man in a worn coat, boots cracked at the toes, had just taught $1 million institution that some things aren't for sale. By the next morning, the front steps of the Peachtree Bank looked nothing like they had 24 hours earlier. What had started as whispers inside a quiet lobby had become a current running through the city. The live stream clip had gone viral overnight. One video titled, Homeless Man Walks In and Says He Owns a Land. And he's right, hit nearly 500,000 views before noon. Local news stations replayed it on loop with grainy zoom-ins on Walter Jennings, standing calmly at the counter, holding his wrinkled envelope like it was a key to something far bigger than property. And now, the people had come. Not in mobs, not in protest, at least not yet, but with presence. Elders with walking canes stood shoulder to shoulder with young college students wearing backpacks and carrying hand-painted signs. Some held up old black and white photos of grandparents who once owned land before it was lost in legal confusion or buried under decades of red tape. Others just came to watch, to witness, to say, I believe him. Camera crews lined the sidewalk. Reporters angled for better views. Microphones bobbed in the air. One woman from a local station shouted through the glass, Mr. Jennings, would you be willing to speak with us? Another young man from a podcast channel asked a bank employee, do you believe what he's saying? Is it true? Inside the bank, the atmosphere was electric but hushed, like a stage play unfolding behind a curtain of glass. Brittany stood behind her counter, eyes glued to the window. She wasn't laughing anymore. Neither was anyone else. the tellers whispering clusters, phones buzzing, hearts racing. Cliff Wallace kept pacing near the coffee machine, muttering to himself and checking his watch. John Delgado, the branch manager, stood near the front door, now flanked by 2 public relations reps who had flown in that morning. One of them wore an earpiece and kept repeating phrases like controlled messaging and optics management. And then just before noon, the bank made a move. A polished, suited spokesperson stepped outside and stood behind a makeshift podium placed near the entrance. Flashbulbs flickered. Microphones surged forward. We want to begin by acknowledging Mr. Walter Jennings and the documents he brought forward. The spokesperson read from a carefully typed sheet. The bank recognizes the historical and legal significance of property in question and the oversight in reviewing its ownership status. We are actively working to resolve this matter in good faith. There was no applause, no cheers, just the sound of camera shutters and scribbling pens. The spokesperson continued, "We deeply appreciate the legacy of Mr. Jennings' grandfather and the contribution of the Jennings family to the history of this land. An apology has been formally issued, and we are in discussions to reach a fair and respectful resolution." Walter watched through the glass, unmoving. He hadn't asked for a podium. He didn't need a camera. He just wanted them to say it out loud. And now they had. The apology wasn't perfect. It was corporate, carefully worded, sanitized, and meant to check boxes. But it was a start. Back inside, Brittany slowly approached him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They're really doing it," she said. Walter gave a slow nod. They had to. The truth doesn't stay quiet forever. The morning sun hung low over Peachtree Avenue, casting a soft golden light across the sidewalk in front of the bank. A small crowd had already begun to gather, neighbors, students, reporters, community leaders. Some came in suits, others in hoodies and jeans, but everyone stood facing the same thing. A fresh brick pedestal, newly cemented near the front entrance. On top of it, gleaming in the sunlight, was a bronze plaque. It read, "In honor of Ezekiel Jennings, 1889 to 1954, builder, father, landowner. His legacy lives on." Walter stood a few feet away, dressed in the same coat he'd walked in with on that first day. This time, it looked different, not because it had changed, but because the people looking at him had. There were no whispers now, no snickers, no suspicious glances toward his shoes or hands. Just silence, the respectful kind. The kind that comes when people know they were wrong, but don't yet have the words to say it. Brittany stood near the back, holding a program in her hands, her eyes misty. Cliff Wallace was there too, but quieter than anyone had ever seen him. He shifted uncomfortably, folding his arms, his gaze glued to the ground. The reporters who had once come for a headline were now just trying to keep up with something that felt too human for clickbait. Next to the plaque, a representative from a local nonprofit stepped forward. "We're honored to announce the official launch of the Jennings Foundation," she said into the microphone. "A housing assistance fund that will serve families at risk of homelessness, especially those who, like Mr. Jennings once did, fall through the cracks of forgotten systems and unspoken history." She turned to Walter. "This is more than a settlement. It's a statement that stories matter, that names matter, that justice is not just legal, it's generational." There was no need for applause. The moment didn't ask for noise. It asked for reverence. Walter stepped forward and laid his hand on the plaque. It was cool to the touch, but it pulsed with warmth, the kind that only comes from being remembered. For decades, his grandfather's name had lived only in worn letters on a folded deed, passed through calloused hands, sheltered in closets, tucked in envelopes, almost lost. Now it stood in the open, solid, unshakable. Walter didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. But when he finally turned to face the crowd, he didn't talk about the money he refused or the mistake the bank had made. He simply said, "My grandfather believed we were worth something. That land wasn't just dirt. It was legacy. And I wasn't going to let anyone forget that." The crowd didn't cheer. They nodded. Some wiped their eyes. In the back, Brittany lowered her head. Cliff swallowed hard, because they had laughed. They had seen a man walk in and decided who he was before he opened his mouth. And now, they stood at a ceremony for the name he carried, the name they didn't even try to learn. Walter placed a single white flower at the base of the pedestal. Then he stepped back, letting the plaque speak for itself. It wasn't long after the plaque went up that Walter Jennings found himself in a classroom, not a courtroom, not a news interview, but a simple public school classroom just 2 miles from where his grandfather had once laid down the first boards of a now-vanished church. The request had come from a teacher at the local high school who had followed Walter's story and reached out. She asked if he'd be willing to speak to her senior civics class. Just a few words, maybe 15 minutes. He said yes, though he didn't know exactly why. He wasn't used to being asked to speak. He wasn't used to being asked anything. So, on a Thursday morning, he walked into room 204 in his same old coat, holding a manila folder with a few faded papers, and stood in front of 30 students who had already seen his face on TikTok, Instagram, and the local news. But none of that mattered once he started to speak. "I didn't come here to talk about banks," he began, hands folded over the folder. "I came to talk about memory." The room quieted. He talked about his father, how he used to speak in stories that sounded like dreams. He talked about his grandfather Ezekiel, who couldn't read legal language but knew the value of land, of roots, of not letting other people write your ending. Then he held up the deed, carefully laminated now, and said, "This paper didn't just give me a legal right. It gave me something back that I didn't even know I'd lost. My place." He didn't quote law. He didn't throw out statistics. He just spoke plainly. About family. About the cost of being forgotten. About how the system doesn't always steal from you with a gun. It can do it with a filing cabinet, a missing signature, a closed door. But when you know your name, he said, and where it came from and what it meant to people before you, you walk different. You speak different. Because you carry something real. A student in the back raised her hand and asked, "Why'd you hold on to that envelope all those years?" Walter looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Because it was all I had," he said. "And because I knew if I lost it, I'd be proving them right, that we didn't come from anything, didn't matter, didn't build. But we did. My people did." By the time he finished, not every student understood the weight of what he said, but some did, and the teacher did. And the boy in the front row who'd been quiet the whole time lingered afterward just to ask where he could look up deeds for his own grandfather's old farm. Walter left behind copies of the original deed and a short guide he'd written. How to track family land records, how to ask questions, how to make sure your story didn't get erased just because someone else wanted the land it sat on. He didn't need to be called a hero. He didn't want a statue. He just wanted kids to know that what was theirs was worth fighting for, even if the fight took a lifetime. As he left the classroom, a few students nodded, some waved, and one girl said softly, "Thank you, sir." He tipped his head. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep your papers. And keep your name." Walter's story reminds us that dignity isn't something given. It's something we carry, even when the world refuses to see it. In a society that too often judges people by their appearance, wealth, or status, Walter showed us the quiet power of patience, persistence, and memory. He didn't demand attention. He didn't seek revenge. He simply asked the world to remember what it tried to forget, that his family mattered, that history matters, and that our stories, no matter how buried, have the power to rise when we hold on to the truth. In your own life, don't let anyone tell you your name doesn't carry weight. Keep your documents. Know your roots. And speak your truth, even if it takes years to be heard. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more powerful true stories that remind us what justice, legacy, and quiet courage really look like. Because sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from shouting, but from standing tall and simply saying, "I belong here."